The evening crowd at the Grandview Hotel was the same as always. Men in expensive suits talking about money. Women in designer dresses sipping champagne that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. The rooftop restaurants sparkled with city lights below, and the guests sparkled with diamonds and gold watches above. And somewhere in between all that sparkle, there was Elena. She moved through the tables like a ghost. That's how she thought of herself sometimes. A ghost in a black uniform, carrying plates and refilling water glasses while rich people talked right through her like she wasn't even there. 3 years she had worked at this restaurant. 3 years of smiling at people who never bothered to learn her name. 3 years of saying, "Yes, ma'am," and "Right away, sir," while her feet ached and her heart felt heavier with each passing month. But Elena had a secret, and it was eating her alive. She was 28 years old now, but when she closed her eyes at night, she was 16 again. 16, and sitting at a grand piano in Madrid, her fingers dancing across black and white keys while her teacher nodded with approval. She could still smell the old wood of that practice room. She could still feel the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. She could still hear her mother's voice saying, "My daughter is going to be famous someday." That was 12 years ago. A lifetime ago. Elena's family had owned a small textile business in Spain. Nothing fancy, but enough to live comfortably. Enough to pay for piano lessons and conservatory fees. Enough to dream big dreams. Her father used to sit in the corner of the room during her practice sessions. His eyes closed, a small smile on his face. He didn't know anything about classical music, but he knew his daughter had something special. Then everything fell apart. It started with the economy crashing. Orders stopped coming in. Bills piled up. Her father tried everything to save the business. But some storms are just too big to survive. Within 2 years, they lost everything. The business. The house. The dreams. Elena remembered the day she had to leave the conservatory. Her teacher had pulled her aside and told her she was one of the most gifted students he had ever taught. "You have something rare," he said. "Promise me you won't give up." She had promised. But promises are hard to keep when your family is struggling to put food on the table. They moved to America when Elena was 20. Her father's brother lived here and offered to help them start over. But starting over is never as easy as it sounds. Her parents worked long hours at minimum wage jobs. Her younger brother was just 15 and needed to finish school. Someone had to hold the family together. That someone became Elena. She took the first job she could find, waiting tables at a diner downtown. The tips were bad, and the hours were worse. But she showed up every single day. She picked up extra shifts. She learned to smile even when her body was screaming for rest. And slowly, very slowly, things started to get a little better. Then her father got sick. The medical bills were enormous. Even with insurance, they couldn't keep up. Elena watched her mother age 10 years in 10 months, working double shifts at a cleaning company while caring for a sick husband. Her brother was in high school now, a smart kid with good grades who deserved a chance at college. So Elena made a choice. She found a better-paying job at the Grandview Hotel. The tips here were much better, because rich people sometimes threw money around like it was nothing. She moved into a tiny studio apartment so she could send more money home. She told her brother that his only job was to study hard and get into a good school. She told her mother to cut back her hours and take care of Papa. She told herself that this was just temporary. That someday, when things were stable, she would find her way back to music. But 4 years passed, and she never touched a piano once. It wasn't that she couldn't find one. There were pianos in hotel lobbies and music stores and churches. But every time she saw one, something stopped her. Fear, maybe, or shame. She wasn't sure which. All she knew was that the girl who used to play Chopin with tears streaming down her face felt like a stranger now. Someone she used to know. Someone she used to be. These days, Elena's fingers only carried plates, Tonight was busier than usual. The restaurant was hosting a charity gala for some arts foundation. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. Here she was, surrounded by people raising money for the arts. And she couldn't even afford to buy herself a keyboard to practice on. The centerpiece of the evening was a beautiful Steinway grand piano, positioned near the floor-to-ceiling windows. It sat there like a king on a throne, glossy black and absolutely magnificent. Every time Elena walked past it, she felt a physical ache in her chest. Her fingers would twitch at her sides without her permission, like they remembered something her mind was trying to forget. She forced herself not to look at it. The guests tonight were the usual crowd, plus some new faces. There were tech billionaires and real estate moguls, and a few people she recognized from magazine covers. They all talked loudly about their donations and their vacation homes and their children's private schools. Elena listened to these conversations without meaning to. It was hard not to. When you were invisible. At the center table sat the hosts of the evening, a man named Richard Thornton and his wife, Vivian. Elena had served them many times before. Richard was the kind of rich man who barely acknowledged service staff. Not mean exactly, just completely unaware that the people serving him were actual human beings, with lives and stories and dreams. His wife was different. Vivian Thornton noticed the staff, but not in a good way. She noticed them so she could find things to complain about. The water was too warm. The bread was too cold. The waitress was too slow. Elena had learned to be extra careful around Mrs. Thornton. One wrong move, and she would call the manager over, demanding that someone be fired for ruining her evening. Tonight, Vivian was in a particularly bad mood. Elena could tell by the way she was snapping at everyone around her. The servers in the kitchen were already whispering about it. "Watch out for table 1, they warned each other. "She's on the warpath." Elena took a deep breath and picked up a tray of champagne glasses. Just another night, she told herself. Just another few hours of being invisible. She would smile and serve, and go home to her empty apartment. She would heat up leftover rice and watch something mindless on her phone until she fell asleep. And tomorrow, she would do it all over again. But something felt different tonight. Elena couldn't explain it. There was a strange electricity in the air, like the universe was holding its breath. She looked at the piano again, even though she had promised herself she wouldn't. It almost seemed to be looking back at her. She shook off the feeling and walked toward the tables. The hired pianist was supposed to arrive any minute now to provide entertainment for the evening. Elena wondered what it would be like to be that person, to walk into a room and have people actually want to hear what you had to offer. To be seen instead of invisible. She had no idea that in less than an hour, she would find out. The champagne was flowing and the conversations were getting louder. Elena moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Her tray balanced perfectly on one hand, while she cleared empty glasses with the other. She had done this 1,000 times. Her body knew the rhythm of the work even when her mind was somewhere else entirely. And tonight, her mind kept drifting to that piano. She couldn't help it. Every time she passed by the Steinway, her eyes would steal a glance. The way the chandelier light reflected off its polished surface. The perfect arrangement of black and white keys. The curved lid propped open like a bird ready to take flight. It was the most beautiful instrument she had seen in years. Stop it, she told herself. Focus on work. But the piano kept calling to her. It was like running into an old friend on the street. Someone you loved deeply, but hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who reminded you of everything you used to be before life got in the way. Elena checked her watch. The hired pianist was now 30 minutes late. She had overheard the event coordinator making frantic phone calls in the hallway. Something about traffic and an accident. The coordinator looked like she was about to have a nervous breakdown. At table 1, Richard Thornton was checking his phone every few seconds. His wife, Vivian, had stopped complaining about the service and started complaining about the silence instead. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Vivian said, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "We're paying thousands of dollars to host this event, And we can't even have proper music? What kind of establishment is this? Richard held up his hand. I'm handling it, dear. Well, handle it faster. Our guests are getting restless. Elena approached the table carefully. Mrs. Thornton's champagne glass was almost empty, and in Elena's experience, an empty glass meant more complaints. Better to refill it quickly and get away before anything went wrong. She reached between two guests and tilted the bottle gently. The champagne poured in a perfect stream, not a single bubble out of place. Elena had practiced this move hundreds of times. She was good at her job, even if no one ever noticed. But tonight, her luck ran out. As she pulled the bottle back, her elbow barely brushed against Vivian Thornton's silk shawl. It was the lightest touch imaginable. Elena barely felt it herself, but Vivian reacted like she had been struck. "Excuse me!" Vivian jerked away dramatically, clutching her shawl like it was a wounded child. "Watch what you're doing." "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Elena said quickly. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to. You nearly spilled champagne all over my Hermes shawl. Do you have any idea how much this costs?" Elena kept her eyes down. "I apologize, ma'am." "It certainly won't, because I'm going to speak to your manager about this." "Honestly, can't they hire competent help anymore?" Vivian looked around the table at her guests, expecting them to share in her outrage. A few of them nodded sympathetically. Most just looked uncomfortable. Elena's cheeks burned with humiliation. She wanted to say something. She wanted to point out that she had barely touched the shawl, that nothing had been spilled, that there was no reason for such a reaction, but she knew better. 3 years at this job had taught her that arguing with guests like Vivian Thornton only made things worse, so she apologized again and backed away from the table. As she retreated toward the kitchen, she heard the conversation continue behind her. Richard was on the phone, his voice tight with frustration. "What do you mean he's not coming? The whole evening is planned around live music." A pause. "A car accident? Is he okay?" Another pause. "Well, that's terrible. But what am I supposed to do now? We have 200 guests expecting entertainment." He hung up the phone and addressed the table. "The pianist was in an accident on the highway. He's fine, but his hand is injured. He won't be able to play tonight." A ripple of disappointment spread across the table. Vivian threw her hands up in disgust. "This is a disaster," Richard continued. $200,000 raised for the arts, and we can't even provide music. The foundation is going to look ridiculous." One of the men at the table, a large man with a red face and an expensive watch, laughed loudly. He was the kind of person who thought everything was a joke, especially other people's problems. "Well, Richard," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Elena with his wineglass, "maybe the waitress can play for us. She seems to have talented hands." The table erupted in laughter. Even Vivian cracked a smile, though hers was more cruel than amused. "Oh yes," another guest added. "I'm sure she's a concert pianist in her spare time, between refilling our water glasses." Of course. More laughter. Elena stood frozen near the service station, close enough to hear every word. Her face felt hot. Her hands were trembling slightly. She knew they were just making jokes at her expense, because that's what people like them did. She was nothing to them. A punchline. A prop in the background of their glamorous lives. But something was happening inside her. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It started as a small spark in her chest, a memory of who she used to be. A flash of her teacher's voice saying, "You have something rare." The echo of her father's smile, as he listened to her play. All those years of practice and sacrifice and dreams that were supposed to mean something. She looked at the piano again. Really looked at it this time. And then she looked at the table of laughing guests. These people who had everything handed to them on silver platters. These people who assumed that a waitress couldn't possibly be anything more than a waitress. These people who saw her uniform and decided they knew her whole story. They didn't know anything about her. The spark in her chest grew into something bigger. It felt like a fire that had been smoldering for 4 years, finally catching oxygen. Before she could stop herself, before her brain could list all the reasons this was a terrible idea, Elena heard her own voice, cutting through the laughter. "Actually," she said, "I can." The laughter stopped instantly. Every head at the table turned toward her. Richard Thornton raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? I can play," Elena said. Her voice was clearer now, steadier than she expected. "The piano. If you need someone." For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence was almost funny. These wealthy, powerful people, who always had something to say, were suddenly speechless. A waitress had just offered to play piano at their exclusive charity gala. It was so unexpected that nobody knew how to react. Then Vivian Thornton let out a sharp laugh. It was not a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh designed to make someone feel small and stupid. "Oh, this is too good," she said. "The waitress thinks she can play piano." She looked around at her guests with theatrical amusement. "By all means. Dear, show us what you've got. This should be entertaining." The others chuckled nervously, waiting to see what would happen. Some of them were already reaching for their phones, ready to record what they assumed would be an embarrassing disaster. A waitress making a fool of herself at a fancy party. It would make a great story to tell at their next dinner party. Elena felt their eyes on her. She felt their doubt, and their amusement, and their condescension. A part of her wanted to take it back, to apologize and disappear into the kitchen and pretend this never happened. But another part of her, a part she thought had died years ago, refused to back down. She straightened her spine and walked toward the piano. Each step felt like a mile. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. The entire restaurant had gone quiet now. Guests at other tables were turning to watch. Even the staff had stopped what they were doing. Elena reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting on its smooth surface. The last time she had touched a piano was in that practice room in Madrid. She had been a different person then, a girl with dreams and possibilities, stretching out in front of her like an endless road. Now she was a 28-year-old waitress with aching feet and a tiny apartment and a family depending on every dollar she earned. But she was also still that girl. Somewhere deep inside, she had never stopped being that girl. Elena sat down on the bench and adjusted its height. Her body remembered exactly how high it needed to be. She positioned her feet near the pedals and placed her fingers on the keys. The ivory felt cool and familiar beneath her fingertips. Like coming home after a very long journey. She took a deep breath, and then she began to play. The first note hung in the air like a question. Elena's finger had pressed down on a single key, and the sound that came out was pure and clear and perfect. It filled the restaurant and bounced off the windows and seemed to make the very air vibrate. Then came the second note, and the third. And suddenly Elena wasn't thinking anymore. She wasn't worrying about the wealthy guests watching her, or the job she might lose, or the bills she had to pay. All of that melted away like snow in spring. There was only the music. She had chosen to play Chopin's Ballade. No. 1-inch, G minor. It was the piece she had performed at her final recital at the conservatory, the one that made her teacher cry. Back then, she had practiced it for months until every note was burned into her memory. And now, 4 years later, her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The opening melody was soft and sad, like someone telling a story about loss and longing. Elena's hands moved across the keys with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone who had spent years carrying heavy trays. But piano had been her first love, her truest love. And some loves never really leave you, no matter how long you stay apart. The guests at table 1 had stopped smiling. The man who made the joke about the waitress playing piano was staring with his mouth slightly open. His wine glass was frozen halfway to his lips, completely forgotten. Vivian Thornton's expression was harder to read. The cruel amusement had faded from her face, replaced by something else. Confusion, maybe, or disbelief. She kept looking around at the other guests, as if waiting for someone to tell her this was some kind of trick. But it wasn't a trick. It was real. Elena moved into the faster section of the piece, her fingers flying across the keys with increasing intensity. The music grew louder and more passionate. It was like watching a storm build on the horizon. You could feel it coming. Feel the energy gathering. Feel something powerful about to be unleashed. At other tables, conversations had completely stopped. Forks were set down mid-bite. Champagne glasses were lowered untouched. Every single person in that restaurant was watching the waitress at the piano, and not a single one of them could look away. A woman at a nearby table had tears forming in her eyes. She didn't even seem to notice them. She just sat there, completely captivated, letting the music wash over her like a wave. Elena didn't see any of this. Her eyes were half closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the piece. She was somewhere else entirely. She was back in that practice room in Madrid with afternoon sunlight streaming through dusty windows. She was sitting beside her father on their old couch, while he listened to her play on their second-hand upright piano. She was 16 years old again, full of hope and dreams and the absolute certainty that music was her destiny. The Chopin piece reached its emotional peak, a cascade of notes that seemed to pour directly from Elena's soul. Her fingers struck the keys with power and precision, building to a climax that made several guests gasp out loud. Then it softened again, like a wave pulling back from the shore, gentle and peaceful and heartbreakingly beautiful. When the final notes faded into silence, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The restaurant was completely still. Then someone started to clap. It was a single person at first, somewhere near the back of the room. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant had erupted into applause. Real applause. The kind that comes from genuine amazement, not polite obligation. Elena's eyes opened slowly, like she was waking from a dream. She looked out at the crowd of wealthy guests, all of them on their feet, all of them clapping for her. The waitress, the invisible woman who refilled their water glasses. She didn't know how to react. Part of her wanted to run away and hide. This was too much attention, too many eyes on her. She had spent years learning to be invisible, and now suddenly everyone could see her. But another part of her felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Real, honest pride in who she was and what she could do. Richard Thornton was the first to speak. He had to raise his voice over the applause. That was... He paused, shaking his head in disbelief. That was incredible. Where did you learn to play like that? Elena stood up from the bench on shaky legs. I studied at the Conservatory of Madrid, she said. A long time ago. One Main. I tutin. The conservatory? Richard looked stunned. What are you doing working as a waitress? Croup. It was a simple question. But it carried so much weight. What was she doing? How had she ended up here, serving champagne to strangers, instead of performing on stages around the world? Elena thought about her father in that hospital bed. Her mother's tired eyes. Her brother's college textbooks stacked on his tiny desk. All the sacrifices and choices that had led her to this moment. Life happened, she said simply. Before Richard could respond, an older gentleman from another table approached the piano. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Elena had served him many times before. He always said, please and thank you, which made him unusual among the regular guests. Young lady, he said, that was one of the finest performances of that piece I have ever heard. And I've heard many. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. My name is Bernard Chen. I'm on the board of the City Philharmonic Orchestra. I would very much like to speak with you after this evening. Elena took the card with trembling fingers. The City Philharmonic. It was one of the most prestigious orchestras in the country. She had dreamed of playing with them when she was a student. I'm not. She couldn't find the right words. Bernard smiled warmly. Just think about it. That's all I ask. The applause had finally died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. People were whispering to each other, pointing at Elena, pulling out their phones to text friends about what they had just witnessed. The waitress, who played Chopin like a concert pianist. It was the kind of story that would spread fast. From across the room, Elena's manager was staring at her with a mixture of shock and concern. She was probably wondering if she should fire Elena or give her a raise. Elena looked back at the piano. She wasn't ready to stop. The music was flowing through her now, and after 4 years of silence, she needed more. "Would you like me to continue?" she asked, directing the question at Richard Thornton. He laughed, a genuine laugh this time. "Please, by all means. I think you've earned the right to play as long as you want." Elena sat back down at the bench. She thought about what to play next and settled on Debussy's Clair de Lune. It was softer and more dreamlike, perfect for a quiet moment after the intensity of the Chopin. As her fingers touched the keys again, she glanced over at table 1. Most of the guests were watching her with newfound respect and admiration, but Vivian Thornton wasn't looking at Elena at all. She was staring down at her lap, her perfectly manicured hands folded tightly together. Her face had changed somehow. The sharpness was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like guilt. Elena turned back to the piano and began to play. The music filled the restaurant once more, soft and gentle and full of hope. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights sparkled like earthbound stars. And somewhere in the crowd, phones were recording everything, capturing a moment that would soon travel far beyond these walls. Elena didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change forever. This wasn't just a performance. It was a beginning. The universe had finally stopped holding its breath. Elena played for nearly an hour that night. She moved through piece after piece like she was making up for lost time. Debussy melted into Liszt. Liszt gave way to Rachmaninoff. Each composition flowed into the next, and with every note, Elena felt another piece of herself coming back to life. The guests had given up any pretense of eating or socializing. They simply listened. Some had pulled their chairs closer to the piano. Others stood along the walls, holding their champagne glasses, but never drinking from them. A few people had tears running down their cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. Elena's co-workers watched from the edges of the room, their serving trays forgotten. Her friend from the kitchen, a woman named Rosa, who had worked at the Grandview even longer than Elena, was crying openly. She had known Elena for 3 years and never once heard her mention anything about playing piano. But Rosa understood something that the wealthy guests didn't. She understood what it meant to have dreams that got buried under the weight of everyday survival. She understood what it felt like to be so much more than the job you worked. And watching Elena play, watching her finally show the world who she really was, felt like witnessing a miracle. At table 1, Richard Thornton had completely forgotten about the charity event he was supposed to be hosting. He sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Elena, shaking his head slowly in amazement. Every few minutes, he would lean over to whisper something to the person next to him. Things like, "Unbelievable," and "Where has she been hiding?" His wife Vivian had not spoken a single word since Elena started playing. She sat rigid in her chair, her face pale, her eyes distant. Something was happening inside her that she couldn't quite name. Every time Elena's fingers danced across the keys, Vivian thought about the cruel words she had spoken earlier. The way she had snapped at this woman for barely touching her shawl. The way she had laughed when someone suggested the waitress could play piano. Vivian Thornton was not used to feeling ashamed of herself. She had spent her whole life surrounded by people who agreed with everything she said and laughed at all her jokes. But right now, in this moment, she felt small. Because the truth was staring her in the face. She had looked at Elena and seen nothing but a uniform, a servant, someone beneath her, and she had been completely, utterly wrong. The music shifted again. Elena began playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and the room seemed to hold its breath. This piece was different from the others. It was slower, more intimate, filled with a sadness that seemed to reach into your chest and squeeze your heart. Elena thought about her father as she played. He was better now. Thank God. The treatments had worked, and he was slowly regaining his strength. But there had been dark nights when Elena sat alone in her apartment, terrified that she would lose him. Nights when she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything but worry and pray and hope. All of that pain poured into the music now. Every sacrifice she had made, every dream she had set aside, every time she had smiled at a customer while her heart was breaking inside. It was all there, in the notes, raw and honest, and impossibly beautiful. A woman at table 7 started sobbing. Her husband put his arm around her, but he looked like he might cry too. They didn't know Elena's story, but somehow the music told them everything they needed to know. It spoke of struggle and loss, and the kind of love that makes you give up everything for the people you care about. When the final note of the sonata faded away, Elena lifted her hands from the keys and let them rest in her lap. She was breathing hard. Her whole body was trembling. She felt emptied out and filled up at the same time, like she had just run a marathon and crossed the finish line. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then, the room exploded. The applause was deafening. People didn't just clap. They cheered. They whistled. They shouted, "Bravo," like they were at the opera. It went on, wave after wave of appreciation and amazement, until Elena thought it might never stop. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her manager rushed over and helped her to her feet, and even she had tears in her eyes. "Elena," her manager said, her voice barely audible over the applause. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Elena didn't have an answer. Or maybe she had too many answers. Because telling people meant explaining why she stopped. It meant admitting that she had given up on her dreams. It meant facing the gap between who she was and who she had wanted to become. But now, standing in front of this crowd of strangers who were applauding like she had just performed at Carnegie Hall, Elena realized something important. She hadn't given up. She had just taken a detour. A long, difficult detour through years of hard work and sacrifice. But the music had never really left her. It had been waiting inside her all along, patient and faithful, ready to come back whenever she was ready to let it. Bernard Chen, the man from the Philharmonic, made his way through the crowd. He was clapping harder than anyone, his face lit up with genuine joy. "My dear," he said, taking both of her hands in his, "you must audition for us. I'm not asking, I'm insisting. Talent like yours cannot be wasted carrying plates." Elena looked down at his business card, still clutched in her trembling fingers. The City Philharmonic Orchestra. It seemed impossible, like something from a dream. "I haven't played professionally in years," she said. "I'm out of practice. I'm not ready for something like that." Bernard shook his head firmly. "What I just heard was not someone out of practice. What I just heard was someone who was born to play. The technique might need some polishing, but the soul?" He pressed a hand to his heart. "The soul is already there. You can't teach that. You either have it or you don't. And you, my dear, have it in abundance." Around them, guests were lining up to speak with Elena. Some wanted to shake her hand. Others wanted to take photos with her. A few pressed business cards into her palm, talking about recording contracts and concert opportunities and things Elena couldn't even process right now. Richard Thornton approached with his checkbook in hand. "I want to personally fund a scholarship in your name through the Arts Foundation," he said, "for young musicians who face financial hardships. What do you think?" Elena stared at him. An hour ago, this man hadn't even known she existed. Now he wanted to create a scholarship in her name? "I say yes," Richard replied with a smile. "It's the least we can do, after what you gave us tonight." Through the crowd, Elena caught sight of Rosa watching from near the kitchen. Her friend gave her a thumbs up and mouthed the words, "I'm so proud of you." Elena felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Then she noticed someone else. Vivian Thornton was standing apart from the crowd, not pushing forward like the others. She was watching Elena with an expression that was hard to read. Not hostile anymore. Not cruel. Something softer. Something almost human. Their eyes met across the room. For a long moment, neither of them looked away. Then Vivian gave a small nod. It was barely visible, just a tiny movement of her head. But Elena understood what it meant. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition, maybe even the beginning of an apology. Elena nodded back. The night was far from over. There were still hands to shake, and photos to take, and conversations to have. But as Elena stood there in her waitress uniform, surrounded by people who finally saw her for who she really was, she felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. She felt like herself again. Elena didn't sleep that night. She got home to her tiny apartment around midnight, kicked off her shoes, and sat on the edge of her bed staring at the wall. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop since she left the restaurant. Messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Notifications from apps she barely used. Something strange was happening, but she was too exhausted to figure out what. She finally looked at her phone around 2 in the morning. What she saw made her drop it on the floor. The videos from the gala had gone viral. Someone had uploaded a recording of her playing Chopin, and it had already been viewed over 100,000 times. The comments section was flooded with messages from strangers all over the world. People calling her amazing. People saying her music made them cry. People asking who she was and where they could hear her play again. Elena picked up her phone with shaking hands and scrolled through the comments. Most were in English, but she saw Spanish and French and Portuguese and languages she couldn't even identify. Her performance had traveled across oceans while she sat alone in her apartment, completely unaware. She called her mother. It was late, but her mother answered on the second ring. She never slept well these days anyway. Elena tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and confused. Playing piano at a fancy restaurant. Rich people clapping. Videos on the internet. A man from the Philharmonic who wanted her to audition. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she started to cry. "Mija," she said through her tears, "your father and I always knew this day would come. We knew you couldn't hide your gift forever. But I gave it up," Elena said. "I stopped playing. I let it go." "No, my love. You put it aside because you had to. Because you chose your family over yourself. That's not giving up. That's sacrifice. And now, God is giving it back to you." Elena cried too. She cried for all the years she had lost. She cried for all the dreams she had buried. She cried because her mother still believed in her, after everything. And she cried because, maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. The next few weeks passed in a blur. The video kept spreading. News stations picked up the story. A local reporter showed up at the Grandview wanting to interview the waitress who played Chopin. Then a national morning show called. Then an international news outlet. Elena's face was suddenly everywhere, and she had no idea how to handle it. Her manager at the restaurant was surprisingly supportive. She gave Elena time off for interviews and told her to take whatever opportunities came her way. "You deserve this," she said. "You've worked harder than anyone I've ever met. It's your turn now." Elena auditioned for the Philharmonic on a Tuesday afternoon. She wore her nicest dress, the one she had bought years ago for a job interview she never got. Her hands were trembling as she walked into the concert hall. The space was enormous, with rows and rows of empty red velvet seats stretching back into darkness. Bernard Chen was there, along with several other board members and the orchestra's conductor. They sat in the front row with notepads and serious expressions. Elena felt like she might faint, but then she sat down at the piano, and everything else disappeared. She played 3 pieces that day: Chopin, Liszt, and a contemporary composition she had learned just for the audition. When she finished, her dress was damp with sweat, and her fingers were sore from pressing the keys so hard. The conductor stood up slowly. He was a stern-looking man in his 60s who had barely smiled the entire time. Elena braced herself for criticism. Instead, he started to clap. They gave her a standing ovation in that empty concert hall, just the 5 of them applauding like she had played for thousands. "Welcome to the Philharmonic," the conductor said. Elena got the job, not as a soloist right away, of course. She started as an accompanist, playing with other musicians during rehearsals and smaller performances. But Bernard promised her that solo opportunities would come. "Be patient," he said. "Your time is coming." She kept her job at the Grandview for 2 more months. She didn't need the money as much anymore. But she wasn't ready to leave. That restaurant had been her life for 3 years. The people there had become like family. She wanted to say goodbye properly, on her own terms. On her last night, something unexpected happened. Vivian Thornton came to the restaurant without her husband. She asked to be seated at a small table in the corner, away from the other guests. And she specifically requested Elena as her server. Elena approached the table with caution. She hadn't spoken to Vivian since the night of the gala. She had no idea what to expect. Vivian looked different somehow, smaller, less intimidating. She was dressed simply, without the usual designer labels and expensive jewelry. When she looked up at Elena, her eyes were soft. "Please," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Sit with me for a moment." Elena hesitated. Servers weren't supposed to sit with guests. But something in Vivian's voice made her pull out the chair and sit down anyway. "I owe you an apology," Vivian said, "for how I treated you that night. For how I've treated you every time I've come here, actually." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I was cruel to you. I was cruel because I thought I was better than you, and I was wrong." Elena didn't know what to say. She had imagined this conversation many times, but now that it was happening, she couldn't find the right words. "When you played that piano," Vivian continued, "something changed in me. I realized that I had spent my whole life judging people by their jobs, their clothes, their bank accounts. I never stopped to wonder who they really were, what dreams they had, what they had sacrificed." She finally looked up and met Elena's eyes. "You taught me something that night, and I wanted to thank you for it." Elena felt tears building behind her eyes. They talked for almost an hour. Vivian told Elena about her own life, the pressures of being a society wife, the loneliness that came with always having to be perfect. Elena shared stories about her family, her years at the conservatory, the hard choices she had made. By the end, they were both crying and laughing at the same time. When Vivian left that night, she hugged Elena. A real hug. Tight and warm and genuine. "I'll be at your first solo concert," she promised. Front row. Elena's last shift ended at 11 o'clock. Her co-workers threw her a small party in the kitchen after the restaurant closed. There was cake and cheap champagne and a card signed by everyone on staff. Rosa made a speech about friendship and dreams and never giving up, and everyone cried. As Elena walked out of the Grandview for the last time, she stopped and looked back at the building. 3 years of her life had happened inside those walls. 3 years of aching feet and forced smiles and quiet desperation. But also, 3 years of friendship and resilience and learning how to survive. She wouldn't trade any of it. 6 months later, Elena performed her first solo concert with the City Philharmonic. The concert hall was packed. Her parents sat in the front row, her father healthier than he had been in years, her mother clutching a bouquet of flowers. Her brother was there too, now in his 2nd year of college, beaming with pride. And 3 seats over, true to her word, sat Vivian Thornton. When Elena walked onto the stage in her black concert gown, the audience rose to their feet before she even played a single note. They knew her story now. The waitress, who became a pianist. The invisible woman who refused to stay invisible. Elena sat down at the grand piano and placed her fingers on the keys. She closed her eyes for just a moment, remembering everything that had led her to this place. The sacrifices, the struggles, the night that changed everything. Then she opened her eyes, smiled at the audience, and began to play. The music filled the hall like sunlight fills a room. And somewhere in the back, barely visible in the crowd, stood Rosa and the rest of her former co-workers from the Grandview, cheering louder than anyone. Some stories don't have happy endings. But this one did, because Elena had learned the most important lesson of all. Dreams don't die just because life gets hard. Sometimes, they just wait. They wait for the right moment, the right chance, the right person, brave enough to reach out and grab them. And when that moment comes, all you have to do is play.